Sometimes the best engineer in the room is the one everyone just asked to leave. The words hung quietly in Marcus Reed's mind as the glass conference room door clicked shut behind him, sealing off the low murmur of executives inside. For a moment, he stood there in the polished hallway of Whitmore Technologies headquarters, staring at the reflection of the city skyline stretching across the floor-to-ceiling windows. 32 floors above Manhattan, the late morning sun poured through the glass and spilled across the marble floor like liquid gold, but none of that warmth seemed to reach him. Marcus adjusted the worn strap of his messenger bag and exhaled slowly. The interview had lasted less than 15 minutes. 15 minutes to summarize 15 years of work. 15 minutes for a panel of people in tailored suits to decide that a quiet single father from Newark didn't quite fit the image they had in mind. Inside the room, someone laughed lightly, the kind of polite corporate laugh that filled silence more than it expressed humor. Marcus didn't turn around. He had heard that sound before in boardrooms, conferences, and startup offices long before everything in his life had shifted course. Instead, he walked toward the elevators at the end of the hallway, his footsteps soft against the glossy stone floor. The digital panel above the elevator doors blinked downward numbers, 32, 31, 30, as the car rose toward him. A young assistant passed by carrying a stack of tablets and barely glanced up. Another executive hurried down the corridor speaking into a wireless headset about quarterly projections and investor calls. In a building worth more than most small towns, Marcus Reed had already become invisible. When the elevator doors slid open with a quiet chime, he stepped inside and pressed the lobby button. The doors closed smoothly, sealing him into a silent steel box that began its steady descent. For the first few seconds, Marcus simply watched the glowing numbers drop, 31, 30, 29. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small object wrapped loosely in a napkin. It was a toy robot made from mismatched plastic parts and tiny screws, the kind of thing only a curious 8-year-old could build with patience and imagination. One of the robot's arms was slightly crooked, and a handwritten label in blue marker was taped to the chest. -1 Malawian kwacha. Marcus smiled faintly as he turned the little robot over in his palm. His son Noah had insisted he bring it today. For good luck, Dad, the boy had said that morning while the early sunlight crept through the kitchen window of their small apartment. The elevator hummed quietly as it continued downward through the skyscraper. Somewhere far above, inside that conference room, executives were already moving on to the next candidate, the next resume, the next polished presentation. But Marcus Reed didn't rush. He simply stood there holding the tiny robot his son had built, watching the numbers fall toward the lobby, unaware that in just a few minutes something inside that same building would make one of the most powerful CEOs in the city suddenly stop everything and run after the man everyone had just dismissed. The elevator doors opened onto the wide marble lobby with a soft mechanical whisper, and Marcus Reed stepped out into the quiet hum of the morning crowd. The ground floor of Whitmore Technologies felt less like an office and more like the entrance to a luxury hotel, with towering glass walls that stretched nearly 40 feet high and sunlight pouring through them onto the polished stone floor. Employees moved quickly across the lobby carrying laptops and coffee cups, their conversations blending into a low, steady rhythm of corporate life, beginning another busy day in Manhattan. Marcus walked toward the exit without rushing, his messenger bag resting against his shoulder and the small toy robot still resting in his hand. Outside the revolving glass doors, the city waited in motion. Yellow taxis slid through traffic, buses released bursts of air as they pulled to the curb, and the distant echo of a subway train rumbled somewhere beneath the streets. For a moment, Marcus paused near the edge of the lobby where a long wooden bench faced the windows. He sat down and placed the tiny robot beside him while he reached into his pocket for his phone. The screen lit up instantly with a message that had arrived several minutes earlier. It was from Noah. "Did the interview go good, Dad?" The words sat there in simple blue letters, hopeful and patient in the way only a child could be. Marcus leaned back slightly against the bench and watched people crossing the street outside. A delivery truck rolled past slowly, and a bicyclist waited at the red light while the crosswalk signal blinked down its final seconds. He looked back at the phone again and typed carefully, making sure every word sounded calm. "Not today, buddy. But that is okay. We will keep trying." He hesitated before pressing send, then added another line. Your robot helped. After sending the message, he placed the phone in his pocket and picked up the little plastic robot again, adjusting its crooked arm with a gentle twist. Noah had spent nearly 3 hours building it on their kitchen table the night before, spreading out tiny screws and spare parts like a miniature engineering lab. Marcus could still hear his son's voice explaining each piece with absolute confidence, as if the small machine might someday stand beside the robots Marcus used to design in real laboratories. A memory drifted quietly through Marcus's mind, the bright fluorescent lights of a robotics lab years earlier, whiteboards covered with complex equations, engineers debating torque ratios and servo timing late into the night. Back then, Marcus had been the one standing at the center of the room explaining solutions while a team listened closely. That world felt very far away now. A pair of security guards walked past the bench speaking casually about a baseball game from the night before, and one of them held the lobby door open for a group of visitors entering from the street. Marcus stood slowly and slipped the small robot back into his bag. The morning air beyond the glass doors looked crisp and cool, the kind of New York morning where the sky seemed endless above the grid of buildings. He stepped outside onto the sidewalk and turned toward the subway entrance 2 blocks away, blending into the flow of pedestrians moving along Madison Avenue. Behind him, the towering headquarters of Whitmore Technologies continued its steady rhythm of meetings, presentations, and decisions being made high above the city, completely unaware that the quiet man who had just walked out of the building carried knowledge that would soon bring the entire executive floor to a sudden and unexpected halt. High above the Manhattan streets, the 32nd floor conference room of Whitmore Technologies remained bright, with morning light pouring through a wall of glass that overlooked the endless grid of the city. Inside the room, the interview panel had already shifted their attention back to the large digital display mounted on the far wall. The screen showed a rotating 3-dimensional model of a robotic arm designed for automated manufacturing systems, every joint and servo rendered in perfect technical detail. Linda Carter, the head of talent acquisition, stood near the table with a tablet in her hand as she reviewed the candidate notes from the morning interviews. Around the polished walnut conference table sat 3 senior engineers and 1 financial advisor, each flipping through printed resumes while sipping coffee from sleek white cups stamped with the company logo. The quiet man who had left just minutes earlier was already fading from memory. Linda tapped the screen and said calmly that the next candidate would arrive in 20 minutes. Giving them enough time to review the current design proposal that the robotics division had been developing for nearly 6 months. One of the engineers leaned forward in his chair and expanded the model on the screen until the robotic arm filled the display. Its metal joints rotated smoothly in simulation as lines of data scrolled beside it showing torque output, cycle efficiency, and mechanical tolerance levels measured down to fractions of a millimeter. The project was intended to revolutionize high-precision assembly lines, a system capable of operating continuously for nearly 16 hours a day without interruption. Another engineer adjusted his glasses and pointed toward the elbow joint of the digital arm, while explaining that the actuator configuration allowed the machine to maintain consistent torque even during extended operation. The numbers on the side panel glowed bright blue against the white background of the display, each calculation carefully reviewed by multiple teams before reaching this stage. Linda nodded politely as she listened, though her attention remained partly on her tablet where the list of candidates continued to scroll past. Names, degrees, references, and certifications filled the screen in neat rows. Compared to the polished credentials of the other applicants, Marcus Reed's profile had appeared unusually modest. No prestigious university listed in bold letters. No recent executive position, just several years of engineering experience that ended abruptly 5 years earlier. From Linda's perspective, the decision had been simple. Whitmore Technologies required the best talent available, and the world of robotics had no shortage of impressive resumes. At the far end of the table, one of the younger engineers began running a quick diagnostic simulation on the robotic arm model. The system calculated stress distribution across each joint while the digital machine completed repeated assembly movements. Lines of code flashed briefly across the corner of the display as the software processed the test cycle. For a few seconds, everything looked perfectly stable. Then the numbers flickered. The engineer frowned slightly and leaned closer to the screen as a small warning indicator appeared beside the torque output column. He tapped the keyboard again to rerun the simulation, assuming it was a temporary calculation error. The robotic arm repeated the motion sequence once more, lifting an invisible component and placing it precisely onto a virtual assembly line. At first the data remained steady. Then at the 287th cycle, a red notification suddenly appeared on the display. The warning expanded across the screen in bold letters. Actuator stress limit exceeded. The room grew very quiet. The engineer stared at the message for several seconds before slowly turning his chair toward the others at the table. In that moment, a single sentence spoken by the quiet applicant earlier in the interview drifted back into the room like an echo no one could ignore. The red warning indicator glowed on the large conference room screen like a silent alarm that no one in the room had expected to see. For several seconds, the only sound was the quiet hum of the computer system processing the failed simulation. The robotic arm on the display froze mid-motion, its digital joints locked in place while the warning message repeated again in bold letters beside the torque column. Actuator stress limit exceeded at cycle 287. The engineer running the simulation slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the numbers as if they might change if he stared long enough. Linda Carter stepped closer to the screen, her tablet forgotten in her hand as she studied the data scrolling beside the robotic model. The room that had been casually confident only moments earlier suddenly felt much smaller. One of the senior engineers cleared his throat quietly and asked the obvious question. "Run it again." The younger engineer nodded and restarted the diagnostic sequence. Lines of code flickered across the bottom of the display as the system reset the mechanical model and began calculating again. The robotic arm moved smoothly through the first cycle, lifting an invisible component from the digital assembly line and placing it precisely into position. Cycle 10. Cycle 25. Cycle 100. The numbers climbed steadily while the torque readings remained stable. For a moment, it seemed possible that the earlier failure had been nothing more than a minor software glitch. Then the simulation reached cycle 286. The room went completely silent as everyone watched the display. 1 second later, the same red notification appeared again across the screen. Actuator stress limit exceeded at cycle 287. This time no one spoke. The engineer slowly lowered his hands from the keyboard and turned toward the others with an expression that had shifted from confidence to disbelief. "That is not possible," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We tested the torque calculations 3 different times last week." Another engineer leaned forward and expanded the data panel beside the robotic arm, examining the stress distribution across each mechanical joint. Numbers filled the screen in neat columns showing load tolerances, rotational limits, and actuator pressure measured in precise engineering units. The calculations were detailed, complex, and carefully verified by multiple teams. Yet the failure remained there in bright red letters. Linda Carter finally broke the silence. "What exactly is causing it?" The younger engineer pointed toward the elbow joint of the digital arm, where the actuator housing connected to the torque shaft. "The stress is building faster than expected. The moment the system reaches that cycle threshold, the actuator cannot compensate. The model fails." Another engineer frowned and said something that made the room feel even quieter. "Someone mentioned this earlier." Linda's expression changed slightly as she looked from the screen to the table where the printed candidate resumes still lay scattered beside coffee cups and notebooks. A memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. A calm voice. A simple statement spoken without hesitation. "Your arm torque calculation is wrong." Linda turned slowly toward the door of the conference room as the weight of that sentence settled over the entire table. One of the engineers asked the question that suddenly mattered more than anything else in the room. "Who was that applicant?" Linda glanced down at the resume lying closest to her tablet. The name at the top of the page felt much heavier now than it had 15 minutes earlier. "Marcus Reed." For a brief moment no one moved. Then another voice spoke from the doorway behind them, deep and steady with quiet authority. "I would like to see that simulation again." Every head in the room turned at once as Jonathan Whitmore, the founder and chief executive officer of Whitmore Technologies, stepped inside the conference room and walked slowly toward the glowing red warning on the screen. Jonathan Whitmore stepped fully into the conference room, and the quiet authority that followed him seemed to settle over the entire space. He was not a man who raised his voice or rushed his words. At 60 years old, he moved with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades making decisions that shaped industries and markets. And the employees of Whitmore Technologies understood that when he entered a room unexpectedly, something important had already begun to shift. The chief executive officer walked toward the large digital screen where the frozen robotic arm still hung mid-motion beside the glowing red warning. The light from the display reflected across his glasses as he studied the data for several seconds without speaking. Around the table, no one interrupted the silence. Finally, Whitmore said quietly, "Run it again." The engineer nodded and restarted the simulation while the others leaned forward in their chairs. The robotic arm reset and began moving through its assembly cycle once more. The display showed the system lifting a virtual component, rotating its joints smoothly, then placing the piece into position with perfect accuracy. Numbers scrolled beside the model as the cycles climbed steadily upward. 50, 100, 200. Whitmore watched without blinking, his eyes tracking the torque readings with the calm concentration of someone who had reviewed thousands of engineering reports over the years. When the simulation reached cycle 286, the same red notification flashed across the display again. Actuator stress limit exceeded at cycle 287. The robotic arm froze exactly where it had before. Whitmore remained still for several seconds as the room waited for him to speak. Then he asked a single question. Who identified this issue? Linda Carter shifted slightly where she stood near the conference table. The answer felt far less comfortable now than it had earlier in the morning. An applicant mentioned it during the interview. Whitmore turned his head slowly toward her. An applicant? Linda nodded. He said the torque calculation for the arm would fail after several hundred cycles. One of the engineers added quietly that the comment had seemed speculative at the time because the design had already passed several internal reviews. Whitmore looked back at the display again, studying the stress data beside the elbow joint actuator. Then he asked another question that carried far more weight than the first. Where is this applicant now? Linda glanced toward the hallway outside the conference room as if the answer might somehow still be standing there. He left the building about 10 minutes ago. Whitmore turned toward the table where the resumes remained scattered beside the coffee cups and laptops. He picked up the document at the top of the stack and read the name printed across the page. Marcus Reed. Beneath the name was a short summary of engineering experience that ended 5 years earlier after a small robotics company had quietly shut down. Whitmore's eyes moved further down the page where a section labeled patents listed 3 mechanical actuator innovations filed under Reed's name nearly a decade earlier. The chief executive officer read the list once more, then looked back toward the screen where the failed simulation still glowed in red letters. Without another word, he placed the resume back on the table and turned toward the door. One of the engineers spoke cautiously as Whitmore began walking toward the hallway. Should we call security to check if he is still in the lobby? Whitmore paused for a fraction of a second before answering. No, he is already outside. Then the chief executive officer of Whitmore Technologies did something that no one in the room had ever seen him do before. Jonathan Whitmore stepped into the hallway, moved past the reception desk, and began walking quickly toward the elevators with only one thought in mind: finding Marcus Reed before he disappeared into the city. Jonathan Whitmore stepped into the elevator alone and pressed the lobby button with a firm motion, the polished steel doors sliding closed in front of him. The car began descending immediately, the numbers above the panel lighting one by one as the skyscraper floors passed beneath his feet. 31, 30, 29. The quiet hum of the elevator motor filled the small space, while Whitmore folded his arms and stared at the glowing display. In his decades running Whitmore Technologies, he had built a reputation for precision and control. Investors trusted him because he moved carefully, methodically, never reacting to uncertainty. Without clear evidence. Yet the image of the red warning on that simulation screen still lingered in his mind, along with a calm voice from the interview room that had spoken only one sentence before leaving. Your arm torque calculation is wrong. The elevator reached the lobby and opened onto the bright open floor where employees and visitors crossed the marble tiles in steady streams. Whitmore stepped out quickly, his eyes scanning the entrance area with the focus of someone searching for a single detail in a crowded room. The receptionist behind the desk looked up with mild surprise as the chief executive officer of the entire company walked past, without slowing down. Outside the tall glass walls, the streets of Manhattan moved with their usual rhythm of traffic and pedestrians flowing through the morning sunlight. Whitmore walked toward the revolving doors and stepped out onto the sidewalk where the air carried the cool edge of early autumn. For a moment, he stood there studying the movement of the city. People passed by with briefcases, backpacks, and coffee cups, each person absorbed in their own destination. Somewhere among them was a man who had quietly pointed out a flaw that Whitmore's entire robotics division had missed. Across the street, a traffic light changed, and a group of pedestrians began crossing the avenue while a delivery truck rolled slowly toward the next intersection. Whitmore looked left, then right, searching the sidewalk for a worn messenger bag or a familiar face from the resume he had just read upstairs. Then he noticed something simple. About half a block away, a tall man in a dark jacket was walking steadily toward the subway entrance, his pace unhurried as he blended naturally into the stream of morning commuters. Whitmore recognized the messenger bag slung across the man's shoulder and the quiet posture of someone who had already accepted the outcome of his day. Without hesitation, Whitmore stepped away from the building and began moving down the sidewalk, weaving through the crowd with a determination that few people in the company had ever witnessed. The distance between them closed slowly as the traffic noise of Manhattan echoed around the buildings. Marcus Reed reached the subway stairs and paused briefly near the railing, adjusting the strap of his bag before stepping toward the entrance. That was when he heard a voice from behind him cutting through. The busy city sounds with surprising urgency. "Mr. Reed." Marcus turned slightly, uncertain whether the call had been meant for him. A second later the voice came again, closer now. "Mr. Reed, please wait." Marcus looked back over his shoulder and saw a tall, older man approaching through the crowd, his expression serious but focused. For a moment Marcus did not recognize him outside the context of the conference room, but the realization came quickly. The chief executive officer of Whitmore Technologies was walking directly toward him on a Manhattan sidewalk. Marcus Reed stopped near the subway entrance and turned fully as Jonathan Whitmore approached through the steady flow of pedestrians. For a moment the sounds of the city seemed to fade behind the unusual sight of a billionaire executive stepping quickly through a Manhattan crowd as if he had somewhere urgent to be. Marcus adjusted the strap of his messenger bag and waited, his expression calm but slightly puzzled. When Whitmore reached him, he slowed his pace and took a quiet breath, the urgency in his walk giving way to the measured composure people usually associated with him. "Mr. Reed, thank you for stopping," Whitmore said in a steady voice. "I realize you were already on your way somewhere." Marcus nodded politely. "That is all right, sir. I was heading toward the subway." Whitmore studied him for a moment, noticing the quiet confidence that had been easy to overlook inside the formal setting of the conference room. The city traffic rolled past behind them while a group of commuters moved around the two men standing near the entrance railing. "I reviewed the simulation after you left the building," Whitmore said. Marcus listened without interrupting. "The torque calculation you mentioned was correct. The actuator fails at approximately 287 cycles." Marcus glanced briefly toward the street, then back at Whitmore. "I thought it might," he said simply. Whitmore nodded once. "Our engineering team ran the diagnostic twice." The failure repeated both times. For a few seconds neither man spoke. A taxi honked somewhere down the avenue, and a bus released a burst of air as it pulled away from the curb. Whitmore continued, his tone thoughtful rather than confrontational. "You saw a flaw that an entire department overlooked for months." Marcus shrugged slightly. "Sometimes when you build a system from the beginning, you learn to notice small patterns before they become larger problems." Whitmore's eyes shifted briefly to the messenger bag resting against Marcus's shoulder. Inside the bag, the small toy robot rested quietly among notebooks and papers. "I read your resume again," Whitmore said. "Your patents on actuator stabilization were filed almost 10 years ago." Marcus nodded. "That was during my time at CoreMotion Robotics." Whitmore's expression changed slightly with recognition. "The company that closed after the funding collapse." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied calmly. Whitmore looked out across the street where sunlight reflected off the glass towers surrounding the avenue. "You stepped away from engineering after that." Marcus hesitated only a moment. "My son was very young at the time," he said. "Some things in life require more attention than others." Whitmore looked back at him carefully. There was no bitterness in Marcus's voice, only a quiet honesty that made the explanation feel complete without further detail. For several seconds Whitmore remained silent, considering the man standing in front of him, while commuters continued flowing around them toward the subway stairs. Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying a calm certainty that left no room for misunderstanding. "Mr. Reed, your interview today did not end the way it should have." Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly, but said nothing. Whitmore continued, "I would like you to come back upstairs with me. There are several people who need to hear what you already saw in less than 10 minutes. Marcus Reed looked back toward the subway entrance for a moment as the steady stream of commuters continued moving down the steps behind him. Then he turned his attention again to Jonathan Whitmore standing beside the railing. The invitation hung quietly in the air between them, unexpected and almost difficult to believe considering how the morning had started less than 30 minutes earlier. Marcus adjusted the strap of his messenger bag and studied the older man's expression carefully. Whitmore did not appear impatient or defensive. If anything, he seemed focused in the same calm way he had looked while studying the simulation upstairs. After a brief pause, Marcus nodded once. "All right," he said simply. Whitmore gestured toward the building behind them, its tall glass walls reflecting the late morning sunlight across the avenue. They began walking back together through the crowd, the difference in their positions in the corporate world invisible to the strangers passing on the sidewalk. Inside the lobby of Whitmore Technologies, the receptionist looked up again with surprise as the chief executive officer returned only minutes after leaving, this time accompanied by the quiet applicant who had departed earlier. Neither man stopped at the desk. They crossed the marble floor and stepped into the same elevator that Marcus had taken down only a short time before. The doors closed softly, and the car began rising toward the upper floors. Marcus watched the numbers climb again in silence while Whitmore stood beside him with his hands folded loosely behind his back. The elevator reached the 32nd floor and opened directly into the executive corridor. Several employees glanced up as the two men walked past, curiosity briefly flickering across their faces before they returned to their workstations. When they entered the conference room, the engineers and Linda Carter were still gathered around the display, where the robotic arm simulation remained paused at the point of failure. Conversation stopped immediately as everyone turned toward the door. Whitmore stepped aside slightly, allowing Marcus to enter first. "Mr. Reed has agreed to take another look at the design," Whitmore said calmly. The engineers exchanged uncertain glances, the earlier confidence of the room replaced by a cautious respect. Marcus walked toward the large screen and studied the data columns for a few seconds, the same quiet concentration returning to his face that he had shown during the interview. The digital model of the robotic arm rotated slowly on the display, its metal joints reflecting the simulated factory lights. Marcus set his messenger bag on the edge of the conference table and pointed toward the elbow actuator housing where the torque data spiked sharply just before the system failure. "The problem is not only the torque calculation," he said evenly. "It is also the load distribution across this joint during extended cycles." The engineers leaned closer as Marcus explained how the actuator housing could be redesigned with a different stabilization bracket that would spread the mechanical stress more evenly through the joint assembly. He described the adjustment with the natural clarity of someone who had built similar systems before, tracing the movement of the robotic arm with his hand as if the machine were already working in front of him. The room listened in complete silence. Whitmore watched the explanation carefully, his expression thoughtful but increasingly certain. When Marcus finished speaking, the chief executive officer nodded once and looked around the table at his engineering team. "It appears we have just received the most valuable 15-minute consultation in the history of this company." Then he turned back toward Marcus Reed and said with quiet confidence, "Mr. Reed, I believe our conversation about your role here is only just beginning." The conference room remained quiet for several seconds after Marcus finished explaining the adjustment to the actuator housing. The engineers were still studying the design on the screen, their eyes moving across the torque data that now seemed far clearer than it had earlier that morning. One of them slowly began typing a quick modification into the simulation software, following the structural change Marcus had just described. Lines of code flickered across the display, while the robotic arm reset itself once again for another test cycle. The digital machine began moving through its assembly motion with the same smooth precision as before. 10 cycles passed, then 50, then 100. No warning appeared. The torque readings remained stable as the robotic arm continued its repetitive movement, lifting the invisible component and placing it back into position with mechanical accuracy. The engineers leaned forward in their chairs as the number climbed past 200 cycles, the point where the system had failed every time before. 285, 286, 287. The robotic arm continued moving without hesitation. A few seconds later, the system reached 300 cycles, then 320. The data panel remained clear of warnings. Finally, the engineer running the program leaned back and let out a slow breath. The stress distribution had stabilized exactly as Marcus predicted. The room that had felt tense moments earlier now filled with quiet astonishment. Jonathan Whitmore looked from the screen back to Marcus Reed with an expression that was both thoughtful and decisive. "Mr. Reed," Whitmore said calmly, "I believe our robotics division has spent 6 months searching for a solution that you identified in less than 10 minutes. Marcus rested his hands lightly on the edge of the conference table, his posture relaxed as if the outcome of the simulation had been expected rather than surprising. "Sometimes when you step away from a problem for a while," he replied quietly, "the solution becomes easier to see." Whitmore nodded slowly, then reached for the resume that still rested on the table beside the laptops and coffee cups. He studied the page one more time before placing it carefully in front of Marcus. "Your interview earlier this morning ended far too quickly," Whitmore said. "I would like to correct that mistake." The engineers around the table exchanged glances as Whitmore continued speaking with the same calm authority that had built Whitmore Technologies into one of the most respected engineering firms in the country. "Our robotics division needs leadership from someone who understands both design and responsibility. Based on what I have just seen, I believe you are exactly that person." Marcus remained silent for a moment as the offer settled over the room. Through the glass wall of the conference room, the Manhattan skyline stretched endlessly under the afternoon light, the city moving far below without any awareness of the quiet decision being made 32 floors above the street. Whitmore extended his hand toward Marcus. "Mr. Reed, I would like to offer you the position of lead systems engineer for our robotics division, effective immediately if you choose to accept it." Marcus looked at the outstretched hand for a second before shaking it firmly. Then he reached into his messenger bag and carefully pulled out the small toy robot his son had built the night before. The plastic machine rested in his palm with its crooked arm and blue marker label reading MK1. Whitmore noticed it immediately. "Did you design that as well?" he asked with a faint smile. Marcus shook his head gently. "No, sir," he said. "That one was built by my son." Whitmore studied the small robot with quiet interest. "In that case," he replied thoughtfully, "it appears talent runs in the family." Marcus smiled slightly as sunlight reflected across the glass walls of the conference room, and for the first time that morning the future felt just a little more certain than it had an hour earlier.